Assalamu alaikum. We are having lecture number 16 of Pakistan Studies. In this lecture, we will be examining the Objectives Resolution of March 1949. In this connection, we would be examining this from three perspectives. One, we will talk about the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan, how it was established. Second, the resolution, which means the Objectives Resolution of March 1949. Three, the explanation of the resolution and its importance. First, we take up the first aspect of this topic, that is the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. We are briefly talking about the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan because it was this first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan that passed the Objectives Resolution of 1949. This assembly came into existence under the Indian Independence Act of 1947 at the time of independence. However, its roots can be traced back to 1946, when elections for the Constituent Assembly of United India or the British India were held, and the Constituent Assembly held its first meeting in December 1946, to be precise, 9th December 1946. The Muslim League did not participate in it because the Muslim League demanded a separate Constituent Assembly for Pakistan. When Indian Independence Act came in July 1947, in the light of the June 3rd plan, which we have discussed in our previous lectures, the assembly, that is the first Constituent Assembly, came into existence. It comprised the members of the old Constituent Assembly from the districts that became part of Pakistan. Originally, there were 69 members, but later on, more members, 10 in total, were gradually inducted in order to provide representation to the princely states that had acceded to Pakistan, and also to people who had migrated from India to Pakistan. So its strength went up to 79, but actually it was less than that because some members died and some members left for India. Therefore, its actual strength went down slightly from 79. In this Constituent Assembly, there were two major political parties. The Muslim League, which had led the movement for the establishment of Pakistan. The other major party, although smaller, much small than the Muslim League, was the Congress Party, and its members were from East Pakistan or East Bengal, as it was called at that time. There were also a couple of Muslim members who were not part of the Muslim League. However, these two political parties, the Muslim League and the Congress, were significant, especially the Muslim League. This Constituent Assembly performed two functions. The first function was constitution making. So it would at time act as the Constituent Assembly. The second function which it performed was law-making, that it would also make ordinary laws for state of Pakistan. So in other words, it was performing two functions. Constitution making, then it was called the Constituent Assembly. And when it is performing ordinary law making, it would be described as Legislative Assembly, but the title was the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. It is this Constituent Assembly that passed the objective resolution that we are going to discuss very soon. The first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan that came into existence at the time of independence in August 1947 lasted until October 1954. In October 1954, the first Constituent Assembly was dissolved. So the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan remained in office for little over 7 years. This is the first constitutional document which serves as the foundation of the Constitution, sets out the parameters and identifies the goals and the objectives the constitutional makers wanted to achieve. This resolution was moved by Liaquat Ali Khan, who was Prime Minister at that time, and the Constituent Assembly debated this resolution in at least 5 sessions. They deliberated it in great detail on all clauses and all provisions. And on March 12th, 1949, the objectives resolution was adopted by the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. What I'm going to do now is to identify the main features, the provisions of the objectives resolution. Once that has been done, then I would give you the explanation and the background of different provisions and principles set out in the objectives resolution, and then I will talk about its importance in Pakistan's history of constitution making. The first feature of the objectives resolution you can also describe as the first principle, first constitutional principle outlined in the objectives resolution is that sovereignty all over world or entire universe belongs to Almighty Allah alone. That's the first principle. The second principle is an extension of the first, and it says the authority which he has delegated to the state of Pakistan through its people for being exercised within the limits prescribed by him is a sacred trust. That's the second principle. The third is the Constitution will be framed for sovereign, independent Pakistan. Fourth principle is the state shall exercise, that is the state of Pakistan, the state shall exercise its power through the representatives of the people. Fifth, principles of democracy, freedom, equality, tolerance, and social justice as enunciated by Islam, as presented by Islam, will be fully observed. The sixth principle outlined in the Objectives Resolution of 1949 is that the Muslims shall be enabled to organize their lives in accordance with the teachings and requirements of Islam as set out in the Quran and the Sunnah. The seventh principle, which is relevant to our study, is minorities will have freedom to freely profess and practice. I repeat those words: to profess and practice their religions and develop their cultures. This was the seventh principle. The eighth principle is very similar to the seven. It says that there will be provisions for safeguarding legitimate interests of minorities, backward and depressed classes. So in addition to religious minorities, the Objectives Resolution was talking about the backward and the depressed classes. The ninth principle is that Pakistan will be a federation with autonomous units. The 10th principle is that there will be measures to protect state sovereignty and territorial integrity. That will be protected. The 11th principle highlights that the people of Pakistan will have an opportunity to prosper and to attain their rightful place in the comity of nations and make contribution towards international peace, progress, and happiness of humanity. These 11 principles are, in brief, the principles or the gist of the Objectives Resolution. These serve as the guideline for constitution making in Pakistan. the principles enunciated in the objectives resolution are also, in a way, aspirations, the desires, the goals, the objectives for which the Constituent Assembly was to frame a constitution. That is to say, Pakistani polity or Pakistani political system was to move in the direction of achieving those goals outlined in the objectives resolution. You can say the same thing in other words, that the constitution that was to be framed by the Constituent Assembly was to reflect the principles outlined in the objectives resolution. I will now refer back to the principles set out in the objectives resolution in order to explain them. The first principle, which comes after the opening line of Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, is that sovereignty belongs to Almighty Allah. This is the primary feature of Islamic political system, that God, Almighty Allah, is the source of authority, source of power for whole universe. This notion that sovereignty or all authority belongs to Almighty Allah is different from the notion that is practiced in Western democracy, where sovereignty belongs to the people. Here, it's not the people, it's Almighty Allah, which is the source of ultimate power and ultimate authority in this world, and the objectives resolution, and also later on, the constitutions of Pakistan recognized this principle. In fact, this sentence, that sovereignty belongs to Almighty Allah, is incorporated in all the constitutions Pakistan had since that time. The next line, which we have outlined while discussing the principles, is an extension of this principle. When you say sovereignty belongs to Almighty Allah, a logical follow-up is that the power and authority that is to be exercised by the state of Pakistan, or those who will be exercising power in the name of state of Pakistan, will have to function within the limits prescribed by Allah. They can't violate His commands, His principles, which have to be followed at all time. And this job of exercising authority or exercising power is a sacred trust. Nobody, no leader, no institution can claim that this authority, this power totally and absolutely belongs to him or her. It's a responsibility. It's an obligation. And as an obligation, it is a sacred trust, because ultimately power belongs to God, and if you are exercising it, it is a trust on you. It is your duty, and it's not your personal or your group's power. Another important principle that comes out of the objective resolution is the institution of representation. In the principles which I have outlined, it is very clearly stated that the power will be exercised through the representatives. It's not that somebody can grab power and claim that power to be his or hers. This system of representation is provided for in the objective resolution. Those people who will exercise the power as a sacred trust will be the representative of people. In other words, the objective resolution provides for a democratic and a representative system. It provides access to power to the people through their representatives. Therefore, the principle of representation is of vital and significant importance. It is understandable that this principle was incorporated in the objectives resolution. If we go back to the freedom movement period, we find that the Muslim League, while striving for Pakistan, was claiming to be the representatives of the Muslims. And through 1946 elections, it established its credentials as the main representative and the sole representative body of the Muslims. And that principle is reflected here. That is, that there will be representatives of the people, because that principle existed within the Muslim League framework before independence. There is another principle that we have discussed, which stresses the importance of modern notions of democracy, freedom, equality, tolerance, and social justice. These principles are the foundation and basis of any civilized political system. Islam also provides for these principles. In fact, equality, tolerance, social justice have been the characteristic features of Islam. Therefore, here the objective resolution was combining the two. That is why it says that these principles will be implemented as enunciated in Islam, as presented in Islam. In other words, this principle combines the modern notion of state governance, like representation, which I have discussed a couple of minutes earlier, then principles of democracy, freedom, and equality, which are found in both. And the objectives resolution has emphasized Islam because in the pre-independence period, Muslims of this subcontinent were defining their national identity with reference to Islam, Islamic culture, heritage, and civilization. And you see the reflection of both in the objectives resolution. There is another important principle emphasized in the objectives resolution. That is the enabling clause. You would recall that the objectives resolution says that the state, that is the state of Pakistan, will create conditions to enable the Muslims to organize their lives, to lead their lives in accordance with the principles and teachings of Islam as set out in the Quran and the Sunnah, which are the main sources of guidance, sources of inspiration for the Muslims all over the world. Now here, the objectives resolution is talking about an enabling role of the state. That state would facilitate, the state would help, state would create conditions where Muslims will be in a position to lead their lives according to the principles and teaching of Islam. Here the element of coercion has been excluded. State is not forcing people, but enabling them. This enabling principle, whereby you facilitate, is in line with the principles of Islam, which does not believe in use of coercion, use of force in the religious domain. Therefore, it becomes the obligation of the state to create positive and helpful conditions and helpful environment. In addition to this, the objective resolution also talks about the minorities. It's not simply saying that this should be done or that should be done for Muslims. The framers of the objectives resolution were fully conscious that non-Muslims are also citizens of Pakistan. Therefore, the objectives resolution specifically talks about the protection of their rights. We have seen in the principles that the objectives resolutions talks about the religious minorities, it talks about the backward and depressed classes, those sections which for some reason have not been able to move along with other sections of the society. And for the religious minorities, it provides them full freedom to profess and practice their religions. They are to be given freedom to go to the religious places, to follow their religious principles and religious practices. And in addition to that, they were also assured facilities for promotion of their own cultures. And similarly, the objectives resolution shows much concern about the need to help the backward classes and also depressed classes, what should be their rights and how their rights, their interests, their religion and their culture could be protected. This also reflects one of the primary teachings of Islam. The teachings of Islam, which emphasize tolerance and which give freedom to non-Muslims to practice and follow their own religious practices and their own cultural norms. And this principle is clearly reflected in the objectives resolution and also in the subsequent constitutions that were made in Pakistan. Another important principle in the objectives resolution related to the federal structure of government, that Pakistan will be a federal state where its units, and in case of Pakistan these units are called provinces, the constituent units of Pakistani Federation will enjoy autonomy within the defined field, within the defined limits. The provincial governments or administrations of the units of the federation will have power to do and handle their own affairs. The introduction of system of federation was understandable. In a diversified society, federal system is more workable. And again, if we look at the political legacy of Pakistan, that is to say, if we go back to the period of freedom movement, we'll find that during that time, the Muslim League was demanding a federal system with autonomy to the provinces. The idea was that if there is a federal system and autonomous provinces, then in the provinces where Muslims are in a majority, they will be free to handle their own affairs. Therefore, Muslim League had been demanding a federal model with autonomy for British India until 1940. It was in 1940 that the Muslim League demanded partition of India and establishment of a separate state. So after the attainment of independence, it was natural, it was understandable that the Muslim League and the members of the Constituent Assembly will go for a federal model, for federation with autonomy to the provincial units of the federation. All Pakistani constitutions that we will be discussing later on incorporated this principle of federalism and autonomy for provinces. Another important principle of significance and of relevance is the emphasis on protection of Pakistan's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is one of the primary functions a government has to perform. Because if you can't protect state sovereignty, if you can't protect the territory, if you can't defend the territory of the state, that state disappears. In fact, the security and protection of its territory and sovereignty is one of the primary function of any state or any government of a state. Therefore, this principle has been incorporated in the objectives resolution. You have seen in this discussion that the objectives resolution was carefully prepared and it incorporated certain principles which were to serve as the foundation of the constitutional and the legal and the political structure that was to be created in Pakistan. When the objectives resolution was moved in the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan in March 1949, a number of non-Muslim members who were members of the Congress raised a couple of objections. In fact, these were the fears they had in their mind. And they raised those issues in the Constituent Assembly, which were thoroughly debated by Muslim members as well as the non-Muslim members. One argument which they were giving was that this objectives resolution was mixing religion with politics. And from their perspective, that needed to be separated. Actually, this is what happened in Europe. But that does not mean that it should happen everywhere. In case of Islam, you can't really draw clear lines between the two domains as described by European political thinkers. That is the religious domain and the political domain, or the state and the religion. Here in this case, Pakistan and Islam. This objection was ruled out because the Muslims of this subcontinent had defined their identity with reference to Islam. And there was a general consensus that state of Pakistan will have a relationship with the parameters and principles which they have used to define their identity and then demand a separate state. Another point raised there was the question of sovereignty of God. They were saying that sovereignty should have been with the people, and with God it may be too abstract. Again, it was explained in the Constituent Assembly and outside the Constituent Assembly that this is the cardinal principle of Islam, and this does not mean that some individual or some group would claim to exercise that authority in the name of God. The framers of the objectives resolution were not talking about a theocratic state. They were not talking about a religious state. The authority was to be exercised through the representatives, not through a particular class, but the representatives of the people. But the only limit was that those representatives had to exercise that authority within the limits prescribed by Allah in the Quran and the Sunnah. And this job of exercising power was a sacred responsibility, and it was a trust. Otherwise, people could elect anybody and they would exercise that authority within certain defined parameters. Then there were similar objections like use of Sharia as the basis or the source of action, and also some of them were saying that Pakistan may end up as a theocratic state. Theocratic state basically means a state where a particular class of people can rule the state in the name of religion, or priesthood, or the priests, or religious scholars, because they are religious scholars, because they are priests of Islam, would rule. That kind of notion does not exist in Islam. Therefore, when Liaquat Ali Khan and other people were talking about the Islamic state or state based on the Islamic principles, they were not talking about a theocratic state. In fact, Liaquat Ali Khan and others who were in the Constituent Assembly repeatedly said that it's not going to be a theocratic state. It's going to be a modern democratic state which works within the limits prescribed by God, by Almighty Allah, who is the ultimate source of authority and ultimate source of power. Power ultimately belongs to God, not to the assembly or to a particular class of people or to a particular section of people or to a particular type of people. Whosoever exercises power is exercising as a responsibility. The objectives resolution that we are discussing is, as I said earlier, the basic and primary document of constitution making in Pakistan. It's a framework of political, constitutional, and legal actions or activities. And whenever we discuss the history of constitution making, even history of politics, we go back to the objectives resolution and start from there. It emphasizes the centrality of Islam to the political, social, and constitutional life in Pakistan. It is also a link between the pre-independence period and the post-independence period. The pre-independence struggle for independence launched by the Muslim League, especially the 1946 elections, where Muslim League established its credentials as a representative body. And post-independence period, in the sense that it established a framework of political action. The Muslim Leaguers who were presenting this were modernist Muslims, and they were not in favor of creating an orthodox or extremist Islamic state. A state, to them, that would involve modern notions as well as the ideals and principles of Islam. And all Pakistani constitutions are based on the objectives resolution. And during General Ziaul Haq's time, the objectives resolution was incorporated in the Constitution of Pakistan as Article 2A. This brings an end to our presentation on the objectives resolution. Khuda Hafiz, until the next lecture.